The Fletcher Seventh-day Adventist Church is a Christian people who believe Jesus is the Son of God, the hope of the world, who died on the cross to redeem us all for eternal life with God. Our purpose is to lift Jesus up and love people in. Visit our website at www.fletchersda.org. And now be blessed by the Holy Spirit as you listen to a Bible message.
Our scripture reading this morning is found in Revelation 14, verses 14 through 20. Then I saw a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was someone like the Son of Man. He had a gold crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came from the temple and shouted to the one sitting on the cloud, "Swing the sickle, for the time of harvest has come. The crop on earth is ripe." So the one sitting on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the whole earth was harvested. After that, another angel came from the temple in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, who had power to destroy with fire, came from the altar. He shouted to the angel with the sharp sickle, "Swing your sickle now to gather the clusters of grapes from the vines of the earth, for they are ripe for judgment." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and loaded the grapes into the great winepress of God's wrath. The grapes were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress in a stream about 180 miles long and as high as a horse's bridle.
Well, I want to start with a word of prayer if you'd bow your heads with me. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight. God, you who are the rock that we stand on and the Redeemer who rescues us when we fall off that rock. God, send your Spirit to speak to us in this place today. We ask this in your name. Amen. So I remember the first time I experienced wrath. It was I think I was about 4 or 5, and I was at church. I will not name the guilty to protect them or the church we were at. It's a long, long way from here. And I was just out in I don't even remember how it all started, but I was playing with some of my friends. As a pastor's kid, you grow up in the church a little bit, and that's kind of how it was for me. You're there for every event. You're there for every function. And so I was running around with some friends doing something as a 5-year-old, and for some reason, we got under the skin of this older gentleman. And we called him Dr. Pete. He was a dentist. One of the nicest dudes I've ever known, just a super supportive guy in the church, did everything. We loved going to visit him at the dentist, which is saying a lot as a kid. I always actually liked the dentist because he was a good guy, and we'd actually go to his house for lunch. And so I really liked this guy, but for some reason that day, he was not thrilled. He was not well pleased with our behavior, and I honestly don't remember what we were doing, so it probably was warranted. But he tried to stop us, and I remember we ran. And we were just goofing off. And I remember this feeling of like, maybe I should stop and listen to him, but I don't want to. And I'm just kind of laughing. And we're like running through the church. And we're trying to get away from this guy. And I think he kind of got the gaming instinct up. And kids ran, something small and fuzzy ran, he ran after us, right? And so he couldn't catch us. We're like weaving through the church. And he's running, trying to catch us. And we come around a corner. And being like 5-year-olds, we didn't think about like going somewhere we could escape where there was an exit strategy. We ran into the mother's room, which there was no exit from. So we get in there and we're like, oh no, series of bad decisions. And so like just this, we see him like coming around the corner with this like beet red face, and he's coming towards the door, and I just kind of instinctively just like slammed the door, like right in the dude's face. And I'm like holding the door as a 5-year-old against an adult, right? And so like he's just furious. And at this point, it's probably, understandable. We're just running and being idiots. And he twists the doorknob and he, boom, just slams the door open. And at that point, I saw things were maybe a little bit of a miss. Like, this guy was mad. And again, I had never seen him mad. He's a very kind man. This was kind of an anomaly in his life. And he's been gone for a long time now, so don't feel bad sharing this. No, none of you would know him. But I remember the feeling as he like broke through the door, and I was the closest one. And I remember the feeling of his hands going into my hair, and he grabbed me by the hair and just threw me out the door into the hallway. Just by the hair. And I remember that feeling of like, wow, that escalated quickly. Like, I'm 5 years old, man. Yes, you're bigger, And I don't remember what happened after that. I don't even remember him taking me to my parents. I think at that point there was just kind of, it had gone off the rails for him, and he was kind of like, wow, that wasn't how I meant it to go. And it just kind of like went away, and I stopped running around the church that day. I think I sat in my dad's office in a holy fashion or something. But that feeling of experiencing someone's rage, someone's absolute unbridled wrath, was a terrifying experience, honestly. I still remember that. I mean, I don't remember a lot of things as a 5-year-old. That's one of the few. That's like just crystal clear in my mind. I still remember that feeling of, holding my hair by the roots, just out the door. Wrath is not the most attractive character trait, is it? I mean, imagine if you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, so you're kind of, dating this new guy. Like, oh, yeah, he's great. Well, tell me about him. He's super cute, really funny, and really smart, and he's super wrathful. Yeah. Last week, his little brother was just like chewing too loud, and he threw him through the window. It was awesome. Get her done, right? He's just saying it how it is, right? He put his fist through the wall. It was awesome. What for? Well, no one would change the channel for him. He had to get up to get to the remote, so he just, Like, wrath is not the most attractive character trait that you would look for in a relationship. And for those of us who have maybe a little more of a temper, it's not something that I would say any of us are proud of. If someone said, what are your characteristics that set you up for success in this job? I'm super temper tantrumy. I just fly off the handle. I just rage at, the most innocent things. I assume you're wrong, and I freak out about it. That's just what I do. Oh, okay, don't call us, we'll call you. It's not something that we're proud of. It's not something that we work like, man, I'm really trying to work on my temper to kind of ratchet it up a notch, rage. But we open up the scriptures and we see from front to back a God who on a regular basis acts out of wrath, that he responds out of anger, that there's this level of rage that leads him to even at times eradicate large people groups. And those of us who are honest, when we look at those stories and we're able to step kind of away from some of our excuses like, well, he's God, he knows what's best. Okay, yeah, I believe that. But really in this story, that all these bears to go maul these kids chasing the prophet, really couldn't have, used cats. I don't know, a little less dramatic. Like, there's a bit of uncomfortability, and it's been there since the beginning of Christianity. The early church, there was a large movement of people that came up with the idea that the Old Testament God was different from the New Testament God. And the church as a whole kind of rejected that idea, but it became this actually large movement. A lot of people accepted this because when you compare, especially the Old Testament God and Jesus, they look a little bit incongruous. And the reality, though, is when you look at Jesus, though, Jesus himself rages at times. And then you get all the way up to the end of the story with Revelation, where it's very clear that the person acting is Jesus himself. And we have verses like what we just read this morning of profound violence. And many people are uncomfortable with that. Even people in the secular world look in from the outside and they say, wow, what kind of God is this? I mean, you Christians talk about a God of love, a God of kindness, a God of forgiveness. How does that square with the actual stories in your actual Bible? We're not making stuff up here. We're just reading the Bible. This doesn't match with what you say. And one of the strongest voices to make a statement like that recently was a gentleman named Richard Dawkins. Any of you ever heard of him? He's kind of famous for being outspoken, biologist who doesn't talk much about biology. He talks more about philosophy, which is a whole other issue. But his book, probably the most kind of influential one, is called The God Delusion. And he goes through and he essentially tries to explain why he thinks religion is a problem, what the issues are with our society. And he makes this profound statement. I want to read this to you. Here's what he says. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. He's assuming the Bible's fiction. So even just from that standpoint, he says, even if we just say fiction, this is not a nice dude, he says. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Full stop. And we can hear those words as Christians and feel uncomfortable justly. We can say, well, no, that's not what it really is. That's not how God is. I mean, that he doesn't do these things. But when we actually kind of step outside of a bit of our discomfort with what he's saying, this super strong statement, are we able to find stories in the Bible that back up his claim? Is he just speaking out of nowhere? Is he making things up? There is a wrathful God in the Bible that often we don't want to face. We either make excuses for him, or we say, well, it's not really that way. Jesus is different. I mean, you hear a lot of different responses from people in every denomination. A wrathful God, an angry God. But I want to spend the moments that we have here this morning looking at some of those actual stories, kind of from the front to the back. Some stories that talk about the wrath of God. These stories that Richard Dawkins himself is referring to. And look at some of these and see what does the Bible actually say about that? What does the Bible say about the wrath of God that could maybe help us understand Revelation 14? And the first one I'm going to look at is the flood. And we're going to look at this. Number one, the wrath of God, I believe in the Bible, is not erratic. It's not spontaneous. It's not this thing that's just done because God gets angry. It's done because God's very intentional. It's not because he's out of control. He flies off the handle and puts his arm through the wall. It's because God is in control and he has an intent in doing this. When you look at the flood story, first of all, you've got to understand that this fits into a huge genre of stories back in the time when Moses wrote this. Every culture had a flood story, which is an interesting sociological reality. When you go across the globe to societies that had no interaction with each other, as far as we know, they all have a story about a flood. And the details are different, but the basic premise is the same. Some reason the gods get angry and they come down to destroy the people of the world. A family or a small group is rescued in a boat with animals that come out and they restart the human race. Basically, every single culture on earth has one of these stories. It's quite profound. But the interesting thing about the story of Moses, when he writes it, is that though the details are very similar, the intent is absolutely opposite of all of the other stories. It's very unique in that genre of stories. Because what happens, the most famous one probably is called the Enuma Elish. It's from the Babylonian culture. And what they say is this, that the gods got hungry and they didn't want to have to create all their own meals and like make sandwiches for themselves. And so they made people to be their slaves to make them food, right? So they populate the earth with people. And then as time goes on, the humans have more and more children. It gets noisier and noisier and noisier. And it comes to the point where they're so sick of it, they say, we're just done. We're going to go out and just destroy all these people because they're super loud and annoying and won't shut up, right? So they come down to do that. One of the gods warns these people, and some of them survive. And anyway, the story goes on, and they survive the flood. And the gods feel bad afterwards because they're super hungry, and they just killed all their cooks. They're like, we're hungry. And so when the guy who is in the ark, his name's Utnapishtim in this story, he comes out and makes this offering to the gods, says they swarm down like flies to get their lunch. They're so hungry because that's their food, right? Not the most like far-sighted gods. They kill their own kitchen staff and burn down the kitchen like, no, I'm hungry now. But luckily someone warned one of them and saved the animals and they eat some of it, right? That's the story. The gods are capricious. The gods are random. The gods are spastic and angry and murderous. And all they're doing is using humans as their cooking staff. The story of Noah, it says very clearly what the intent was. It says God came down to the earth and he looked and he saw the earth was full of violence. That in everyone's heart there was evil all the time. That no one was safe. That the earth had become this murderous, terrible place where life wasn't even safe. And so God said, it says that he regretted. It was so violent. It was so nasty that he regretted that he'd even done it in the first place, the Bible says. But he looked down and he sees Noah and his family. And he says, listen, I still want life to continue. We're going to try this again. It's not a God who's just raging. It's not a God who's angry that humans are loud and obnoxious. It's not a God who's angry that they're like, watching, some Sabbath morning cartoons when they shouldn't have their TV on. It's a God that looks down and sees violence and murder and bloodshed to the point where he says, this is not what I created life to be. When I made the garden, it was good. There was life, and now there's death. He says, enough is enough. The wrath of God is limiting. It's not him putting his fist through a wall. It's him saying, I can't stand to see a world this full of violence. It needs to stop, and he limits it. So that's the first one. The next one is Egypt. We kind of come forward in the Bible, and we come down to the story of the children of Israel, and it says that they're in bondage. They're enslaved to the most powerful nation on earth at that point, the Egyptians. And it says God looks down, and he sees them, and why is he drawn to this people group? Why does the Bible say? Anyone have read this before? If you want to look these up later, I'm going to keep going so we don't run out of time. The first one is Genesis 6. You know that story. Exodus 3, 7 to 10. Moses is talking to God, and God explains what's going on here. He says, I've looked down, and I have heard the suffering of this people. I have come down, I have seen the anguish that they live in, so go and tell them I've come to rescue them. Raging God? Maniacal jerk? No, he says, listen, enough's enough. I've given people freedom to make their own decisions. I've given people freedom to even reject the world how I created it to be in the first place. But there comes a point when enough is enough. I can't bear to stand watching everything go off the rails like this anymore. So it's enough. I'm going to come and stop this. And so he goes, most of you know the story, goes to Egypt, and Pharaoh lets all the people go. He's like, you're right. We shouldn't enslave these people. We're kind of jerks, right? That's how the story goes. Like, no, they're so intent on keeping the children of Israel in slavery. Think about this. Like, they believe in the gods. And as they're chasing the children of Israel, they come to the sea, and they're like, yeah, we got them. But then they see this like tornado of doom up in the sky glowing like some like nuclear reactor. And then the sea opens up, and the children of Israel walk through the sea. So what would be your kind of knee-jerk reaction if you were chasing someone to beat them up and you saw God open up the sea for them? And the sea is still open by the God who's helping them escape from you. Let's run down in the sea and see what happens. I mean, they're idiots. I mean, how do you think that's going to end? Like, God's like, okay, whatever, like, close up the sea. Like, these people they were so obsessed with keeping the world the way that it was, that when God tried to come change it back to the way it was supposed to be, what was their response to that? God's goal was not to kill the Egyptians. God's goal was not to kill anybody. He went to them and said, hey, this is not a group you get to enslave. I'm taking them from you. And they said, no, we're going to fight tooth and nail to keep this people enslaved. And so God said, if that's your choice, and this is my choice right now, I'm telling you, I'm going to take them whether you want to or not. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. And they say, well, let's try it the hard way then. And so God does eradicate their military. He kills the firstborn of this nation. God shows that when he says he's going to free someone, he's going to do it. And the children of Israel stand on the side of the sea as the waves come rolling in. And it's this dark picture. And this is a bit of a PG-13 sermon. I'm trying to keep it not too dark. But the stories we're looking at have details we have to discuss. And it says the bodies come rolling up onto the beach. And what do? They mourn. It's kind of a bit of a dark picture. They dance and they sing and they make up songs about how God has thrown the horse and the rider into the sea. Right? Like, they're so excited that God would step in and say, enough is enough. So this is what the Bible says, right? We're not making things up. This is what the stories themselves say. They say God comes, he enacts this flood, but he tells everyone he doesn't want to do it. He gives them 120 years warning them, saying, listen, I'm not going to allow this kind of behavior to continue, so stop it. Like, in 120 years. Not a rage monster. God comes to free a group of slaves. He says, listen, I'm taking these people. The people that have enslaved them fight so hard, they literally risk their own lives to run into the sea that a deity has opened to free that people. They think that they can go up against God and win. God says, fine, I'll close the sea on you. God didn't ask them to go down into the sea. The third one then, we have the children of Israel rolling into the land of Canaan. And it says that God asks them to destroy this people that live there, these different nations, take them out, right? And the language is very strong when you read what it says they did. It says, we destroyed them, every man, woman, child, animal, all this stuff, boom, they're gone. We just decimated these people, killed them all. And so a lot of people read that again and say, wow, how could God do that? How could God be so vicious and violent? Like, why couldn't these people just be asked to move, right? If God wants to push some people in there, why can't they go off and do something else? But the thing is, that's exactly what God did. When you actually read what happened, and you can read this later, Exodus 23, it's God giving the explanation of what was going to happen. He says, go in there and kill all these people. This is what he actually says. God is speaking through Moses. He says, I'm going to send hornets and animals and all kinds of crazy things to chase these people out. And then you can have the land. And he says, this is why. Because I'm a bully? He said, because I don't want you to live in proximity to these people because they're so messed up. You're going to pick up the horrible things that they do and incorporate them into your lives. Was that God being excessive? What happens, we find out later. They do live in proximity with these people and pick up their practices. Again, we're not talking about, well, they had a little pepperoni on their pizza, so down the goat chute to hell for you, right? We're talking about these people sacrificed their children. These people burnt children to death in honor of their gods, and the Israelites emulated that. They picked that up. Just absolutely terrible things. And so God says, I'm driving this people group out because I've given them, he says, 400 years to shape up, and they still will not quit killing their children. And so, again, at that point, he says, I'm not even going to eradicate them. I'm pushing them out. They're going to go live somewhere else because I'm done with them living here. You guys are going to live here at the center of the known world at that point, and you're going to be a witness for me. So God sets this thing up. And so what we see in the Bible, and Pastor Ivan brought this out in another sermon, which is very powerful, was that when we read a lot of this language about how they go in and they slaughter these people and not one person is left alive, it was the way that every group talked back then. When you went to battle, you said, we killed everybody. We destroyed them. It's hyperbole. And that might sound a bit uncomfortable, like, whoa, the Bible's not honest. No, the Bible's very honest. When you read the Bible, it means what it says. And sometimes we think it means something it doesn't say, and that's the challenge. Every people group said that at that point. You went to war, we killed them all. They didn't kill them all. They actually didn't kill many people in warfare back then. That's more of a modern development in warfare where you go and just kill, billions of people. Back then, you fight, you kind of sparred on the battlefield, and one group started to give up, they'd give up and, be captured. And they'd kind of be let go and you'd take over the land. It was not actually violent compared to what we think of. But it's like when you talk about sports today, we killed that team. Someone reading 1,000 years later, they killed that team, America was so violent. Well, it was violent, but you didn't kill any of those people, actually. We just played the game and we won, right? It's that language. And so we have to understand that when we read this language about the extermination of the Canaanites, they weren't exterminated. The Bible's very clear. Not only did God not kill them all, he didn't even intend to in the first place. He says, I'm going to drive them out. And a lot of the people stayed in that land. It says the problem was that they continued to live. God didn't kill them all. The children of Israel didn't kill them all. And they didn't all leave either. And so the problem was that the Israelites picked up that bad, violent religion that they had had. So again, God's limiting. He says, enough's enough. I'm only giving you 400 years to stop killing your children. Wow, what a monster, right? Finally, in this section, with the children of Israel, God comes down and gives them all these rules, how to run their culture, their country. And one of the most kind of well-known is the famous line, an eye for an eye. Tooth for a tooth, bone for bone, right? It's pretty harsh that God would say, I'm the God of the universe that's supposedly known as a forgiving God and all loving and long-suffering, and yet someone takes your eye, you take their eye. Does that sound like Jesus? I mean, that's the God we sometimes assume we're going to meet in the judgment. And the good news is that's not the God we're meeting in the judgment. But we read that, and again, if we're honest about that, it should make us a little bit uncomfortable. Why would God say, take their eye if they take your eye? Why wouldn't he say, love your enemy, turn the other cheek? Because that's what Jesus taught, right? But again, you have to understand the culture of the people of this time. And so when Jesus comes to them and says, or God comes to them and says, an eye for an eye, we read that as saying, that's what you should do. I grew up with little brothers. There were 3 of us. And an eye for an eye, that's not how it played out. Any of you grew up with siblings, especially little brothers? What happens? They take your G.I. Joe. So what, you take their G.I. Joe? No, you punch them in the face. And you punch them in the face. So what do? Punch you in the face? No, they try to choke you out. And they try to choke you out. So what do? You throw them down the stairs, right? Like, it just like escalates very quickly. We actually got along quite well, the three of us boys. But when those times happened, it was just like through the roof. My parents were like, what in the world? You're monsters. Like, right? Like, we talk a lot about justice if we do not act justly. That is not the way it works. And so you have to understand that into a culture very much like that, God came in and says an eye for an eye. If you want justice, that's fine. I'm going to let you seek justice in your community. But if someone takes your eye, you can't do what the natural response is, which is to take their life, right? I mean, this is Appalachia. This is the land of family feuds back in the day, right? 150 years later, families still hate each other for something someone did and they probably didn't even do, right? I mean, that's human nature. And so we have to understand eye for an eye is not a command, you should do this. It's a limiting command that no farther beyond this line can you go. Someone takes the life of your animal, you can't go burn their house down. You can take their animal back. Now you get that one, fine, fair enough, right? It's a limiting justice. The God of the flood is limiting violence. He's not just causing violence. He's coming in as the judge of the universe saying, this is not the way I created the world to be. Yes, you have freedom, but only to this point. The God of the Egyptian plagues is not a God that came in and just threw his weight around. He gave so much time for this people group to let these slaves go. When they were unwilling, he says, okay, but only up to this point. Then I free these people. You've got the God of the Canaanites. God, after 400, 500 years of watching them kill their children, finally exits them from the land. Again, not a knee-jerk reaction, not this angry, violent God, but a God that says, only up to this point. I'll let you do things so terrible, even to the point of child sacrifice, he says. But there comes a point when enough's enough. Eye for an eye. God says, listen, you're a violent people group. Humans are so violent. We're not kind. He says, but you can seek justice, but make sure it's justice. It's not what we think of as justice, where it escalates. There's a guy that I was studying the Bible with back when I was pastoring in Washington, and just one of the kindest people I've ever met. It was a really kind of a strange experience. He came to church almost on like this kind of missionary dating kind of thing. One of our church members, this little girl, was dating this young guy, and so she brings him to church. She had like no interest in church. She'd like just sit and like sleep on the front row, like no interest at all. And so she brings this guy, not a Christian, and he sat there just like spellbound at everything that happened at church. The first time he was there was for communion. It was like the most moving thing. He was just like blown away by this whole thing. So he comes to me and asks for Bible studies. I was able to baptize him eventually. He's actually going to Walla Walla University next year. None of his family are Christians, definitely not Adventists. You see God like kind of pulled this kid out, kind of like a branch from the fire, right? Like that this guy had no reason to be there. God pulls him out. But I'm studying with this guy. He's not a Christian. He doesn't know any of this stuff. And he's reading the Bible and he's being convicted of things. And one day when we were talking, he kind of unloaded his chest a little bit. He's like, listen, I feel kind of bad. Last week I was on the bus going to school. He was a high schooler. And he's like, there was this experience that happened on the bus. There was this bully, this guy, just a real loudmouth, and everyone knows at school, he's just kind of a jerk. And he just kind of started going after this girl on the bus, just saying all kinds of nasty stuff, just like laying into her, just calling her, anything terrible you can imagine, just shredding this little girl. And my buddy Jake just kind of had enough finally. He's like, dude, leave her alone. And he wasn't even friends with this girl. It wasn't personal. He just said, listen, shut up, man. Like, you go sit down. And like most bullies, that doesn't fix it. It just escalated it. And so he starts getting more and more violent, gets up in her face. What are you going to do about it? And like starts yelling at her. And the bus driver's up there just like, like, please get me to my place. I can drop these jackals off and just move on with my day. And so my buddy Jake is like really getting frustrated. He's like, man, stop, leave her alone. What's wrong with you? Whoa, she's an idiot and you're stupid or whatever. What are you going to do about it? And so he's like, what am I going to do? I don't know. What am I going to do, right? And so just kind of in the spur of the moment, he's like, if you don't stop, I'm going to punch you in the face. And the guy's like, what? It's like, no, that's right. If you don't stop, I'm going to punch you in the face. And the guy's like, whatever. And he starts going after this girl again. And so now my buddy's like, I made the promise. I better back it up. So he stands up like, stop, leave her alone. No, I'm not going to leave her alone. boom, he punches the guy just like straight in the face. It's like bloody nose. And the bus driver's like, "Ah, you kids, what are you doing back there?" Like bus is swerving. Everyone's like, "Ah," yelling. And the bully like stumbles back to his seat like, "Here's the jerk." And my friend felt bad about this. He's like, "I feel really bad. I kind of got out of control. I don't know what happened to me." And as he was telling me this story, I was like trying not to chuckle. I looked at him. I was like, "You know what, man? I think that's exactly what Jesus would have done if he would have been on that bus, honestly." He's like, "What?" Because the thing is, there are probably more mature ways he could have handled the situation and different things he could have done. But with the tools that this kid had as like a freshman or sophomore, with no one else around, that his heart was moved for the suffering of this girl that he wasn't even friends with. He said, "Enough's enough. Leave her alone, man." He didn't know what else to do, so he stood up and he swung his arm and punched the guy in the face. That impulse that he would have to not be angry about something that was said to him. This guy wasn't bothering him. To not be bothered by something that was said to one of his friends. This had really nothing to do with him. He just saw the situation and said, "Enough is enough. I can't stand to see this suffering, and it's got to stop. I have to do something." And we see a God in the Old Testament who says, "Listen, you got freedom. I'll let you do what you're going to do. But there comes a point when I say enough is enough, and I will unravel your plans. I will unravel your violence. I will unravel your oppression of the people that you have control over. I will take you down," he says. And it seems violent, and it seems uncomfortable. But when we look at what he says, what his intentions are, and the mercy he gives to those who he says he's going to stop, it starts to give us a bit of a different picture for who he is, that the wrath of God is not just this random thing. It's a very intentional, controlled limiting of the violence of the world. And we see that in the story of Nineveh, right? The Ninevites were a part of the Assyrian nation. The Assyrians were violent in a violent culture. Like I said, in warfare, you didn't tend to like just kill all the other team's people. Once they gave up, you let them go, and you kind of took their armor and stuff, and you maybe sent some off as slaves, But it wasn't this, you didn't just kill everybody. The Assyrians, on the other hand, took warfare at that point to another level. Once they would capture all the soldiers, they were known for putting them on the ground and using threshing machines to end the job. And again, I'm trying not to be too blunt, but you need to understand what these stories mean. That's the Ninevites, an absolutely violent, terrible, aggressive, bloody nation of people that God finally says, "Enough is enough." In the violence of the world, then he says, "You of all people," he says, "Assyrians have taken it too far, and enough's enough." So he sends Jonah. "Go tell them enough's enough. I'm going to toast their city." And Jonah's like, "Yay, I don't want to go. It's not cool." And he jumps, essentially, he has them throw him into the ocean to die. And as I read that as a kid, I thought he was scared of the Ninevites, right? Like, well, there are these violent people. What are they going to do to him? They'll kill him. But again, once you actually read the Bible, go back and read the story of Jonah. It's profound. Jonah says very clearly why he jumped in that ocean to die. And it was not because he was scared of the Ninevites. Because as we see the story play out, he gets to Nineveh. He tells them the great news that they're all toasted. Game over. You're so violent, terrible. God says enough's enough. We're just going to end this now, hitting the reset button. And what's their response? This terrible, horrible, violent, nasty people group breaks down in tears and says, "We're so sorry. What have we done? It's wrong. Is there any chance God will forgive us?" And he does. He does. He spares this people group. He goes to ISIS, and they say, "We're really sorry." And he's like, "All right, no, cool. We cool." Right? And just like Jonah then, we would probably be now. He says, "That's exactly why I jumped in the ocean to die, because I know you're a God who is kind and long-suffering and full of mercy and grace, and you forgive people when they want it. And that's exactly what I knew you were going to do, God. I would rather die than watch you do this." Go read the story if you didn't realize that. That's exactly why. Jonah would rather die than see God's mercy extended to those that he thinks are deserving of his wrath. And God deserved they were deserving of his wrath. God agreed they were deserving of his wrath. And that's one, I think, reason we are uncomfortable with wrath, is because the reality of people we know who are super wrathful, are they right usually? Are they willing to forgive? Are we willing to forgive when we're angry, when we've been wronged? We're not. We would rather see someone toasted for what they did, whether it's true or not, rather than see them be reinstated with mercy and healing. But God when he comes and finally says, enough is enough, his goal is not vengeance. His goal is not revenge, because we see this very clearly. When this group of people turn back from their nasty ways, what's God's instant response? Just kidding, I'm not going to do it. No problem. God's goal was to stop a violent, destructive action, not to hurt people, not to destroy people. And when people turn back from their violence, from their oppression, God's absolute, immediate, unrevocable response was forgiveness. And that's the picture that's often missing as we discuss this God of the Old Testament that brings violence and destruction, that it's always within the context of salvation and healing and rescue. And it's always within the context of massive time periods that we miss, hundreds of years. He says, please stop killing children. Please stop enslaving people. Please stop doing these terrible things. The wrath of God is not erratic. It's very intentional. And secondly, it's not just intentional, it's very focused on protecting the devalued. And we see that again play out through stories. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God comes down and just roasts these cities, man, just eradicates them. And we read the story and we have a lot of opinions. Well, this is why God did it. But there's a profound text that we often don't read where God very clearly says, this is why I toasted Sodom and Gomorrah. Have you read it? It's not in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. He doesn't say why. He just says, I'm going to go down and see if it's bad as I heard it was. And he goes down and is like, yep, it's as bad as I heard it was. Smite button, game over, right? He doesn't say why, though. We kind of infer things from it. But the answer is in Ezekiel 16, 49 and 50. I'm actually going to read this one, so make sure I read it right. If you want to turn there. Ezekiel 16, 49 and 50. This is what it says. God's coming back and talking through Ezekiel to the children of Israel, and he's comparing them back to Sodom and Gomorrah. And they're like, what? We're not like that. This is what he says. He says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty. They did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them, as you have seen. He says as he came down to look at if the city was as bad as he heard it was, what was he looking for? The food they're eating? What they're watching on TV? He says he came down to see how they were treating people. And as he came down, he saw that the people in their culture that were the ones that had no power, the widow, the poor, people that had no ability to protect themselves, that needed the protection and kindness of the community not only didn't provide that protection, they did the opposite, and they came in to hurt people. And we see that again in the story of Lot. The angels come in, the knee-jerk reaction is, we're going to go and hurt these people. This will be fun. It says they were violent and angry and destructive, and God says, enough's enough. Because when God looks down and he sees someone who can't protect themselves, God is automatically on their side. And that's something we see over and over and over in Scripture. We like to talk about how God's on the side of this certain kind of theology or this certain kind of belief system, but what we see in the Scriptures is God does choose sides over and over and over, and when he does, it's always on the side of the oppressed. And it's all through the Scriptures, over and over and over. We see it, again, like I said, in the story of Sodom. God's concerned that they're hurting the people who can't protect themselves. It goes on, the story of a dude named Onan the barbarian, Genesis 38, kind of a crazy story if you've never read it. Not one you probably read for family worship. Give you that heads up. It is not PG-13, it's closer to R or beyond. One of Judah's sons. Strange story. It says that Judah having bad luck with his sons, and one of them dies. God kills him because he was evil, it says. And so his wife is left without children. And in that culture, a woman without children was nothing. She had no hope. And a woman without a husband had no chance of having children. And children were their future. So God had ensured through that culture to say, listen, there's kind of a weird rule, but if you've got some brothers, one of your brothers dies and one of your sister-in-laws doesn't have kids, it's your job to help her have a child. And you don't get to continue having her as an extra wife, but you do have to go in and help her have a child. That's your job. And in that culture, they're like, all right, whatever. What the catch was that dude, the brother that's living, doesn't get to call that child his child. It's not his anymore. It belongs to the brother who's dead and that wife. Weird rule, right? But again, God's intent was that these women would not be overlooked in this system, that they would have a chance to have a future. And so in that context, Judah says to his son Onan, he says, go in and have a child with your sister-in-law. The rules declare this. And he's like, all right, cool. He goes, and it says that this is a continuing thing. The story says it's happened time and time again. But every time Onan went to help her have a child, it says he did something that did not allow it to happen. And I'll let you go and read about it if you would like, to keep this not going too far. And it says God killed him for it. It says what he did angered God, and God killed him. And again, it seems like God's kind of capricious, like random, like, jerk, poof, out, smite button, right? But again, if we look in the story, what's going on is we have this woman who's at the control of her brother-in-law, and he is willing to come in and try to make a baby with her over and over and over and over, but he's going to make sure, the Bible said, that no baby comes out of this. And it says why? It says Onan knew that that child would not be his, and he did not want to give his brother a child. But he'd use his wife. That was fine. It says God looked down and said, enough's enough, dude. You don't just get to use her for pleasure. This had nothing to do with pleasure. This was about you providing a child for her. You were using her and abusing her. Game over. It says God kills Onan. Again, kind of a strong story, but God looks down on someone who is under the control of somebody else, and that control is being used to devalue that person, and God says, that's enough. And I could just go all day on these stories, right? But these are just a couple. The Jews themselves, it says that God looks down and he rescues them, right? But then what happens later? I want to read a verse to you here. It's in Jeremiah 7. Jeremiah 7, it's God talking to them here. Verses 4 to 8. So God's talking to the children of Israel here. He says, do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, if you do not shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow the gods of others to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your forefathers forever and ever. But look, you're trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. And it jumps later, it says, I've been watching. I've been watching, declares the Lord. So the children of Israel themselves, that God would go to such great lengths to rescue from oppression when they find themselves in a position of power and they're using their power to oppress somebody else. Is God okay with that? What's God's response? Is God racist? Does this have an issue of like God chooses this race over that race? What happens when his chosen people start living in a way that's bringing devalue on the weak in their society? What's his answer to that? He said, I'm taking it all back. I'm not giving this land to you anymore. I'm sending you to Babylon. And again, we can go through a million. I'm not cherry picking here. You can read through the prophets. This is over and over and over and over. He says, this is the reason I'm sending you off to Babylon. Because you use your power to oppress the weak, and that's not what I'm about. I'm a God who uses my power to rescue the weak. And you of all people, he says, should know that. I rescued you from Egypt. How could you turn around and therefore use your power to bring down those in your power? A God who is protective. A God who brings value to those who are devalued. And then they're in Babylon, and they're being mistreated. God says to the Babylonians, listen, you're being so violent to my people. You're oppressing them. I'm bringing them back. It seems like God's a bit spastic, right? I'm going to rescue the children of Israel, and now I'm going to throw them to the wolves, and now I'm going to beat the wolves because they bit the people, even though I'm the ones that asked them to do it, right? Back and forth and back and forth. But when we start to understand what is making God do the things he does, that he's there to protect the weak, those who are not able to protect themselves. He's there to redeem. He's there to limit oppression. He's there to limit violence. It starts to make a little bit more sense as there's a continuance of these themes throughout the entire Old Testament. It jumps to the New Testament. Jesus is in the temple, flips over a bunch of tables, all these people's money on the floor. Again, Jesus is angry, right? Jesus is not angry. Old Testament God's angry. You see a lot of the same actions, actually. So Jesus comes in, flips these tables. But again, as we understand the context of what was happening in that place, it all starts to make sense. They weren't just selling things to people. What they were doing, they were selling things to people using temple currency. They said, we can't use this secular currency because it has idols on it, graven images. So you have to trade your money to us for temple money. And of course, they got to set the exchange rate. And you can imagine where it went from there. And so people that are coming in from these distant lands who couldn't bring a cow with them just brought their money. They saved up all their money to come and buy something, to give a gift to God. And not only were they not providing just the gift to these people to help them do this, giving them a fair price, they were price gouging them. They were, again, taking advantage of people who couldn't defend themselves. They're there to buy a gift for God. Where else are they going to buy it? This is their only option. And so they hand over the money to people that are ripping them off in the presence of God himself, using their desire to worship God against them to steal their money. On top of that, the place they were doing this, it says, there's a specific word, talks about the temple area. That was this courtyard on the outer parts of the temple that God had actually called the courtyard of the Gentiles. This was the place that God had said, this is where the Gentiles can come and worship me. Because again, through the whole Old Testament, God's always saying, I'm inviting everyone into this experience. So God sets this place up for them to come worship. What did the children of Israel do? They set up shop there so they can't even come worship anymore. And the people who come to worship in the other places, they rip them off. So Jesus shows up and he just flips these tables over. He says, this is not what my house is supposed to be. My house is supposed to be a house of prayer. And God steps in between, again, the oppressor and the oppressed and says, enough's enough. I'm going to bring value to these people. And the crazy thing is that when we understand why he's doing that, we have a very different response. Because as he flipped those tables, who came running towards him? The gospel says, the children. How do children respond towards anger and temper tantrums? Those of you who have struggled with that have some probably pretty big hurts in your hearts. Have you seen your children scared of you when they shouldn't be? Kids respond to anger very, very, very quickly. And so if Jesus is just out of control, raging dude, are children going to run towards him? Like it says, the children flood his presence. The weak and the lame come running towards him as these money changers are running off with their tails between their legs. The oppressors run, and the oppressed run towards Jesus. Because when we understand why Jesus is doing what he's doing, when we understand why God was doing the things in the Old Testament that he did, it's not a God that we need to be afraid of, it's a God that we run to, because in our oppression, God comes to free us. In the parts of our life that we can't escape from, God comes to bring us escape. In the parts of our lives where we're held down by our weakness or the people around us, God comes and he himself brings us freedom. God frees the slave. And so when we find ourselves in slavery, it's good news that there's a God who would go to such great lengths to free us, isn't it? If we've never really felt slavery, if we've never really felt the feeling of being out of control, would that really make sense to us? We don't even really know what it feels like. I don't know, I guess I want God to take me to heaven someday, but I got my life together. That's why we see in the scriptures that the broken and the weak are the ones that flock to Jesus, while the strong and successful tend to run away. God brings healing, God brings freedom. If you don't need freedom, why would you run towards it? And finally, God's wrath is not only just limiting on evil, God's wrath is not only just protective of those who are held down, but finally, God's wrath is healing. There's a word that the writer of Acts uses as he's writing, and it talks about, he's quoting Peter actually as Peter was preaching. And Peter says that there was this time coming soon that Jesus would come back, and he says, make all things new. And the Greek word is apokatastasis, one of my favorite words. I love saying that, apokatastasis. And that word came from Greek kind of philosophy and theology, and what it meant was this. It meant something that was created, but it was not the way that it was supposed to be anymore. And it was taken and put back the way that it was intended to be in the first place. It was a return to the right ways. It was a return to the things that were supposed to be. It was like unhealth turned to health. It was brokenness turned to strength. It was ashes traded for beauty. It's things put back the way they were supposed to be. And again, as we follow these stories through the Bible, where we see God responding in anger or wrath, we see continually that there is this goal that he's going to put things back the way they were supposed to be in the first place. God creates in the beginning, he says it was good. And then very quickly it becomes violent and murderous and treacherous. And he says, I'm going to put things back the way they were supposed to be. I just want to look at a couple verses with you and we'll wrap this up. Malachi 4 is a famous one. In Adventist theology, we tend to use it to defend like the idea that hell isn't eternal. And so that's probably why you've heard this before. It's one of the last, I don't have these marked, so I got to just kind of find it real quick here. Malachi 4. It says this, surely the day of the Lord is coming. It will burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and evildoers will be stubble. That day is coming and will set them on fire, says the Lord. Not a root or a branch will be left of them. Again, that strong language. Does he say, I'm going to kind of somewhat save you? I'm going to kind of rescue you? He says, it's going to be so final. My rescue, my salvation, my freedom for you is so final that those who would not be willing to let you go free will be ashes. It's done. It's final. There's no form. Not only do they not have strength, they have no form. It says, but for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings, and you will go out and leap like calves released from the stall. This powerful picture. He says, you've been like these animals, like locked up for slaughter. I'm going to come and I'm going to burn it all down, and you're going to go out like an animal that's been released. Any of you who have pets, when you let your dog out to go running, what do? If they're not like cowering on the front row, poor little guy. He's scared of kids. My dog's kind of like nervous of kids too. They're erratic. They're never sure what they're going to do. But you let that animal free and they just run. I love watching my dog run. He just runs. It's like this sheer joy that he's free, and he just runs and runs. And it says that that's what it's like for us. That's the promise of Malachi. He says God is coming to burn it down, not because he's a rage monster, but because there's people who actually would rather fight to keep the world the way it is than to let it be changed back into what God meant for it to be, for apokatastasis to happen. They would rather fight that than let God push it back to the way it was supposed to be. He says, those people that choose that, he says, it's done. And you, he says, will be free as animals running around like crazy. He says, and you'll walk on the ashes. It's that strong language again of absolute freedom. Jesus meets a man in the temple, his hands withered. The Pharisees have brought him to try to trick Jesus, right? It says that they bring him up and say, hey, Jesus, check him out. They knew Jesus couldn't help but heal him. Think about that. They're like, Jesus is so kind, we can use that against him. And so they do. And it says Jesus looks at them, and he looks at the man's hand, and it says he asks them the question, is it better to do good on the Sabbath, to heal, or not? And it says they were silent. This is Mark 3. And it says this, it says Jesus was angry. It doesn't say Jesus was like, oh, shucks, guys, come on. It says Jesus was furious. He looked at these people, and he looked at this man, and he's like, come on, like throwing something on the ground. It's like he's angry. He's like, what is wrong with you people? And it says he reaches out, and it says his anger, what, leads to violence and hatred and all kinds of stuff. It says his anger, he reaches out and he heals the man's hand. That God's anger in this universe is not uncontrolled. That God's rage in this universe is not some like just gut reaction. He can't control himself. That God looks down on death and destruction that we all experience in our health, in our lives, with our relationships, with our own feelings towards ourselves. And it says God's response is he can't help but bring healing. It says he rises with healing in his wings. And his anger is to reach out and heal the world. And the people of the Old Testament especially understood this. And we're going to end with this. Habakkuk 3, or actually book of Habakkuk. If you haven't read Habakkuk, you should go read it today. It's one of my favorite books in the entire Bible. The people of the Old Testament understood all of this, at least when they were in their lucid moments, that God was a God of wrath, not because he was out of control, but because he was a God of love, that his love led to wrath because he couldn't stand to see the people that he loved mistreated and beaten down, that his love had created a perfect world, and yet we broke it and continue to break it, and he just wanted to put it back the way it was supposed to be, a place where we could all be valued and have life the way it was supposed to be. The judges They came to bring salvation, not to like point out what was wrong with you. Have you noticed that? Again, go read the Bible. Don't just assume these things. It's in there. The judges did not come to judge civil cases so much. They came to heal and relieve the people from oppression of countries around them. They came to fight. They were generals, the judges. So judgment and wrath. Habakkuk knows this. And so Habakkuk says this to God. It starts in chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for your help when you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? The law is paralyzed. Justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." He's bringing this challenge to God. He's like, God, I know that you're a God of love and salvation and redemption. Where are you? There's all this violence. And why do you just put up with it, right? Strong words. A lot of us Adventists are uncomfortable to utter, like, well, the great controversy explains it all. Well, then you're holier than Habakkuk, which I doubt. So Habakkuk was comfortable stating these feelings. How long, God? He says, how long do I have to wait for you to actually come do what I know you want to do? He says, this is the Lord's answer. So it's this dialogue back and forth. God says, I'm going to do something in your day that you'll not believe, even if you were told. And he goes back down to talk, so I'm bringing redemption through this way. And he goes farther. Habakkuk comes back. Why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than them? Chapter 2, God answers. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end. It will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. You've heard that one before, haven't you? We don't really understand the context that comes from, do we? It's coming from this deep cry for God to fix the universe and make it the way it was supposed to be. And God's answer is wait for it, though it lingers. And it jumps across then. So this is Habakkuk's answer. In chapter 3, at the end, he says this. He prays this beautiful prayer. He says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. And he's thinking back again to this God bringing the Egyptians down and bringing Israelites out, God rescuing the Israelites. These stories, I've heard what you've done, God. I stand in awe of your deeds. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. He keeps going on. He says, his splendor was like sunrise. His rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled. The age-old hills collapsed. And his ways are eternal. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by, deep roared and lifted up its waves on high. The sun and the moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In your wrath you strode through the earth. In your anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him head to foot. With your spear, you pierced his head. When his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though they were about to devour the wretched who were in hiding, you trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. I heard, and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nations that are invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, though there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no fruit, though there are no sheep in the pen, no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on great heights. They cried out for God, Not a God just of forgiveness, but a God of wrath. Because they understood that only when God returns, it says in this great day, that says, though it lingers, wait for it. Only when God comes and finally unrevocably fixes things back to the way they were, that we will live in a world of violence, where justice is perverted, where the weak are trampled down. But these people longed for a day where that would change. And we see in Revelation, as it progresses through, as we begin to kind of wrap this series up, that these two groups emerge. God calls them the people of God, the righteous, and Babylon. And we see very clearly these two different characteristics. One group, the group Babylon, is willing to literally fight to keep the world the way it is. They want the people in power to be in power. They want, it says, like, essentially the devil, even though they don't know who that is. They want things run the way they're run because a lot of different reasons, but mostly they're doing okay. They want things the way they are. And yet there's this small group the Bible calls a remnant that cry out like Habakkuk and say, God, let your kingdom come. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God, bring your healing. God, limit once and for all this evil on this world that destroys people. God, come and rescue the weak. God, come and put things back the way they were supposed to be. And in the verse that was read today, the verses that were read, we see that cry finally answered in violent language that often we're uncomfortable with. But it says, finally, there's this like reaping of the nations. It says, those who want God to change the world back to the way it was supposed to be, and those who don't. And God finally separates that. And it says he comes and he lights it up, and things go back to the way they were supposed to be. But there's this moment the Bible calls God's strange act, as he doesn't mix any mercy in with wrath. But he says, burns it down like stubble, like ashes. Not because he's angry, not because he can't control himself, not because he's a monster, but because he, at the very core of his existence, can't stand to watch violence and evil rule a world where he intended for the people he created to experience life. And once we start to understand that, we become a little more comfortable. Not like Jonah, where we're like, yeah, God, come roast these people. But like Habakkuk, where we can say, God, let your kingdom come and heal this place. My prayer for you is that you will see that the fact that God is a God of wrath is very good news. And that you will search your heart to truly see if you're living your life in a way where you're truly asking God, let your kingdom come, let it be made back into the way it was in the beginning. Or if you are actually propping up the kingdoms of this world with the way that you live your life, the way that you treat people. And only you can answer that. God is not on the side of an ethnic group. We see with the Jews that God's not even on the side of a religion when it really comes down to it. God's on the side of the people who want to see his kingdom come. And that ends up transcending a lot of different groups that we're sometimes uncomfortable with. But really what it comes down to is I'm only controlling myself. I get to decide through my daily actions. Am I asking God, let his kingdom come? Come and make this place the way it was supposed to be? Or am I more interested in keeping things the way they are? God is a God of wrath because God is a God of love. May you experience God's loving wrathfulness in your life this week as he frees you from slavery, as he gives you value where you've been devalued, and where he brings healing to your life where you've been broken. God, we thank you that you are a God of wrath. Let your kingdom come, God. Let your will be done on earth, in this place, God, as it is in heaven. And as we wait for that, as it lingers, God, help us to wait, not passively, God, but following you, so that you can use us to start turning things back the way they were supposed to be. God, we love you because you first loved us. And we ask this all in your name, Jesus. Amen.
We trust your relationship with God has been strengthened from what you have heard today. Please visit our website at www.fletchersda.org. May God give you his peace and joy.